The three victims were identified as Patrick Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe.
Stuart Armstrong was the man working at the Carpenter's Arms public house at Raywith in the first week of December 1995. The Rettedon killings was a news item which was well covered. He heard it on the radio, or what he called the day it happened. It was either 2 days after or the morning after the killings. He browsed the newspaper about a week later and saw the photo of the Range Rover. The photo did not have any effect, but he recognised one of the people, namely Craig Rolfe. That was because he said 2 nights before he presumed, or it may have been 1 night before the murder, he had seen Craig in the Carpenter's Arms public house. It was either Tuesday night or Wednesday night he had seen Craig. He was asked which night he would favour if he had to pick one, and he said, "Well, I would favour Wednesday because it's usually the," inaudible, "night out, but sometimes he goes out on a Monday or Tuesday." It was early evening, about 8 o'clock. If it was a Wednesday, we were quiet for a Wednesday because normally they're quite busy. It's a very small pub and usually there are not many free tables, but there were some tables free that night. Craig Rolfe was with a male who Mr. Armstrong could not describe, but was a little bit taller. He did not really look at the companion, but was not sure of the build. He noticed Rolfe particularly. He served them, and Rolfe would not agree to be served with a bottle of beer and a glass. He wanted a bottle on his own. He had to speak to him 2 or 3 times to have it in the glass. In cross-examination, he said he was quite frightened by Craig Rolfe's attitude. His manner was basically rude. Ian Williams was the young man who lived at Meadows Road in Rettedon. When police officers made inquiries into the Rettedon murders, he was seen on the 19th of December and asked about his movements on the early hours of the 6th, the Wednesday. He then could remember where he had gone. He left home to go for a walk. He said it was only going to be an approximate time because it was a long time ago, but he would think he left somewhere between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m, and he showed them on a map where he went. He came out of Meadow Road, turning right on the A130 towards Chelmsford, and he almost got to White House Farm and Workhouse Lane, but he was just out for a walk while he could have a look at the snow. It had stopped snowing, but he wanted to have a good look at it. There was not much traffic and the roads were wet. When he got to the Workhouse Lane, he turned round to head in the opposite direction for some reason. His walk would have been a good hour and a half, he thought, and he went back through Battlebridge and up to the Rettedon Turnpike. He did not notice any vehicles going into or out of Workhouse Lane. He did not hear any unusual noise apart from the traffic. He knew the sound of gunshots. He did not hear any on the night of his walk. He was shown his statement in cross-examination made on the 19th of December, which he said would have a bit more basis because it was so much closer to the event. That said, his starting time for his walk was between 7 and 7:10, not between 6 and 7, but between 7 and 10 past 7. He said that it would be more of an accurate assessment of the time he left. The walk must have begun then and finished at around about 8:30 p.m. Rebecca Carr was the lady who was the head of the department in geography at a school in Canvey Island. She was visited by police officers dealing with the Rettedon murders on the 6th of December. She was asked about her movements on the early evening of the 6th. She made a written statement on the 9th of December and some later subsequent statements. She had been asked by the police officers to concentrate on the times of about 4:30 to 4:45. She remembered the Rettedon Turnpike. She wanted to go to the middle lane to go straight on. She was stopped by the lights at about 4:45. In her lane, she had 2 vehicles ahead of her. Beside her, on the offside, was a dark-coloured Range Rover slightly ahead of her. In the front of the Range Rover, there was a vehicle she could not describe. In front of that was a white Ford Sierra. The Range Rover had 3 people inside. She could not see the driver clearly, but the person in the front passenger seat was very large, muscular, broad-built and a big man. In the back and in the middle, leaning slightly forward, talking to the driver and the passenger, there was a person with a similar build to the front passenger who struck her as massive. his whole head, body and shoulders. He had dark brown hair. She saw him from the waist upwards and his arms. He had a blue-green jacket on. The street lighting was an amber yellow. There was also the reflection of the lights from the vehicles. Those three were in her view for approximately a minute and a half, while that vehicle and hers were stopped at the lights. They were about 4 yards away. She saw photographs of the two men by the police officers and she recognised both. The dark-haired photograph was the one in the back, Patrick Tate. His hair was slightly longer on the day she saw him, but she had no doubt it was him. The other photograph was the front passenger, Tony Tucker. As to the Sierra occupants, she said she thought there was probably 3. The front passenger was very big and seemed to fill up the whole front seat. He had a big face. She could not see the face of the driver or the one in the back of the vehicle. The front passenger appeared well dressed and big, wearing a jacket with epaulets and a dark coloured coat. There could have been someone in the back because the whole car seemed to be full. Then she described the vehicle's movements and said the Sierra went off very quickly up the A130. The middle vehicle turned right and the Range Rover gave her the impression that Sierra and the Range Rover were together, and the Range Rover was trying to keep up with the Sierra. As you go north, you climb a hill for about 300 to 400 yards, then the 2 lanes merge. In the village, she could not see the Sierra because the Range Rover was in a line of vision. When the road goes down by the school, she could see the Sierra go round the corner where the main road is shown. It started to indicate to the right and braked hard, and suddenly the brake lights came on very quickly and it also indicated to the right. The vehicles in front of the Sierra went straight on, but the Sierra pulled into White House Farm, into the farmyard where there were Christmas trees around the fence. Both the Sierra and the Range Rover swung in circles, the Sierra wider than the Range Rover. Both stopped, parked with lights on, facing the road. Her thoughts about the occupants, that they had an odd appearance to be going to buy Christmas trees that early. Road conditions were very cold and there had been some snow flurries on the turnpike. She said she heard the news of the murders reported and it bothered her all evening, so she phoned the police and they took her statements. That must have been an evening later than the 6th of December. She was in court as a result of a witness summons by the defence. She originally noticed the Range Rover first because it had been a rather opposing appearance beside her. It was slightly ahead and her view towards it was slightly to the rear of it. She said it then turned off the road. Then, in relation to timing, she said she picked up her child and dropped off her friend at Tarquin's and then had gone to the estate agent who she had left at about 5:15 or maybe 5 minutes earlier. She relied on this estimate of time and hers. This is how she came to be talking about the time. She was positive she had not seen the photographs of the 3 men in the newspapers or on television until the police showed her those photographs. As to any margin of error she had on time, she thought the maximum was 10 to 15 minutes either way. As to her identifications, she was sure of both of the one in the front of the Range Rover Tucker and the man in the back, that is Tate. Kevin Tarbuck was seen by police officers on the 14th of December in connection with the murders 8 days before. He was working at Hanningfield. When he'd finished, he'd come out and turned right onto the A130 and right towards Rettendon on the A127. Before that night, he travelled that road every evening except for the weekends, and on the 6th of December, he was driving a Ford Sierra. He left his work at approximately 7:50, not earlier than 7:45 or later than 8 o'clock. Approaching Rettendon, he neared White House Farm, which he was familiar with. He was not aware of any turning just past White House Farm, but it became familiar on that occasion. It was on his left as he was going towards the turnpike. There were no cars in front or behind him on the road. It was very dark and he had his lights on full beam. A white escort van pulled out in front of him and caused him to brake. He pulled out and turned left towards Rettendon in front of him. He did not see if it stopped. He just remembered seeing it pull straight out in front of him. He braked quite sharply and flashed his lights as well, making what he called an obscene gesture. He got about 30 yards from the car in front and was not right behind it. He could not make out the occupant or occupants, they were only silhouettes. He could not say who was inside, but obviously one person was driving. The driver was accelerating. He got as far as the turnpike and the car in front had disappeared. He said, "My previous occupation was a tyre and exhaust fitter. I am in no doubt it was a white escort van. I'd say the approximate time was 5 to 8. It was in my sight for about 30 seconds. I was interviewed the very next day on the 7th of December and arrangements were made for me to make a statement." Cross-examined by Mr. Lederman, he said his work did not have set hours. He made his statement about a week later, the following Thursday. He agreed his statement started with the words, "At about 7:40 I finished work." He said it was later than 7:40 he started his journey. When he spoke, according to the police, they said someone would come round and someone did come round about a week later. Cross-examined by Mr. Parkins, he said, "As far as I know, it happened at about 7:50. I was working at the West Hanningfield Reservoir. It was about a quarter of a mile to the main road. So as far as I could see, it was just the driver in the car. I could only see someone on the driver's side. There may have been someone else in the car, but I didn't see anybody." He looked at a photograph too and accepted there was a track parallel with the road itself, as well as the White House Farm. He was not aware of that track until now. He did not see the vehicle in the track or on the lane. All he saw was a van moving in front of him. Re-examined, he said there was 2 separate windows in the back of the van. He was asked by the CID later, who asked him if it had been a white Passat. It was definitely not a white Passat. The time was just before 8 o'clock. Ricky Schnell was called. He is known and has been friendly with Darren Nichols for 9 years or so. They went out for a drink together once or twice a week quite regularly. He named the pubs that they went to. He accepted that he made a statement to the police and had been asked if any occasion Darren Nichols was any different to how he usually was. He said, "I have tried, but I honestly can't remember specific times when he may have been different to how he used to be. Normally, he did tell me his personal problems. Early December 95, he may have been working, but it was only odd days anyway. I doubt if I could begin to tell you what any old phone call was made about. I couldn't be specific about the 6th of December 95. He said, since then, I have been told he rang me to go to the pub. Of course, I couldn't specify whether it was that day. I don't remember getting directed to any message service when trying to ring him." He also told you about looking after a BSA 350 motorcycle for Darren in April and May 96 and getting a call from Darren or the police so that they could take a battery to the police which had on it its date 18th of September 95 and the initials RWP. I think those initials would have been the initials of Ron Parkins. He also told you about a man called Colin who was Darren's friend and used to work with him sometimes. He also said that Nichols and his wife were always up and down and Nichols would tell him often about the rows and some he would not have known about until later, if at all. He said Nichols was affected by the rows to varying degrees. He said at 18:44 that night he rang Nichols' number on his mobile, 17:47 and 7:47 at night. That was the sort of time Nichols might call him to go out for a drink. He said Nichols did not ask him to damage anything or destroy anything. He said he was his best friend, the person he saw most of all. He agreed in his statement. He said, "I would describe Darren Nichols as a really soft, accommodating person who'd do anything for you. I think perhaps he was too easily led and could never say no to anyone." Stephen Rodgers was the gentleman who had a detached property on 3 acres of land and stables at Bricknell. It is northwest of the wheat sheaf, about half a mile away. He said he made a detailed written statement on the 13th of December 1995 about what he could recall of events on the 6th of December. He had heard a series of shots. He was working in the village hall until 10:30 p.m. and went home about 11, had a sandwich and a beer and went outside about quarter to midnight to mix some food to give to his fowl. That usually took about 30 minutes. He'd heard something which struck him as unusual around about midnight. He'd heard a series of shots. He said, It's not unusual to hear shots where we live, but this was unusual because it was an extremely cold night and because of the number of shots. He said, I have heard shots during the evening, but they usually come in a series of 2. He said, I didn't count them, but there may have been 6. I'm not sure. There was maybe a second or less between the shots. He described it as a fusillade. It sounded like a shotgun, a noise you are familiar with. He was outside the stables in an alleyway between them, and generally the sound came from the south. It was an extremely still night. He could not work out how far away any of the shots were. He did not think any more of the incident at the time. The following day, he was aware of a news item on the shooting incident. He contacted the police on Saturday the 9th when he heard more shots on that day. The shots he heard were on the Saturday. He knew where they came from. It was White House Farm. It was the sounds of the shots on the Saturday that made him think of what he'd heard in the week, as a result of which he contacted the police. He was outside in the stables when he heard the noise and walked to the edge of the farm to see if he could see where the sound was coming from. The fence he walked to was the fence facing the south. Something in his mind clicked when he heard more than 2 shots. He did not count them. There was a second between shots. It was not like 3 in succession and then a gap. I don't remember a gap, he said. It lasted 5 or 6 seconds or 10 seconds. You heard from William Jasper. He told you he attended as a result of a witness summons. In January 1996, he was seen by the police in connection with matters affecting him and he was interviewed. He gave the police oral and written accounts of matters he'd been involved in at Rettendon. He gave a detailed account, but it was hard to remember where he was. He said he did not know Michael Steele or Jack Wilms, had never seen either of them before or had any association with them. The day before he gave evidence was the first time that he knew he might be required to come here to give evidence in this trial. In cross-examination by Mr. Lederman, he said he'd been arrested on the 15th of January 1996 in connection with another matter. He said he was an associate of major criminals, sometimes concerned with major robberies and drugs including cocaine. The drugs involved sums of 300,000, that sort of amount. The criminals were those who had no inhibitions about shooting each other if they fell out. He wrote the statement at Forest Gate Police Station. He would prefer in court not to name the names he had previously named. The question as to whether he was frightened of them, he said, "You could say that." He said, "You could say that is the reason I prefer not to name them." He said he would not have described them in a full statement about killing if it was not correct, because to do so, it could happen that he was almost inevitably be shot. He told you that he took police officers on a journey once or twice, and it was he who directed them. The route was at his direction. He had taken that journey before. He was pointing out to the officers the route for something that he was a witness to. At that time, he was in a stolen car, a Fiat Uno, and there was a man with him in the car with a holdall. In the holdall was a pump-action shotgun and a handgun. He looked in the holdall during the journey. The holdall was taken by the person down a country lane. The person went over a gate into a field and returned with 2 holdalls. He was not able to see whether both holdalls contained anything. They were put on the floor in the passenger side. He then drove back towards Essex in the Woodford direction and dropped the man in a wine bar. He was paid 5,000 for doing that. He had been asked to do it a week or maybe less before. He was not prepared to name the person who asked him, and he was not prepared to name the man in the car. The passenger on the journey out in the back was wearing hospital gloves. He had not seen the contents of the holdall when he set out. He saw the contents halfway through the journey when the passenger got out to meet someone. He said he was in the Upminster area around about midnight or sometime an hour before or an hour after, so at that stage he was giving himself a 2-hour bracket, either an hour before midnight or an hour after midnight. He said having agreed to do the drive, he did not know the purpose of the journey. When the man returned to the car in the lane, he got into the passenger side. They had gone over a bridge, but he did not know which bridge. He thought it was a couple of minutes away or a minute. He looked at Exhibit 3, the plan. and saw in it a route left into Rectory Lane. He was asked if that's where he took the police, and he said it was possibly so, but he could not remember if that was the bridge. There was a give way sign. He was supposed to give way, but he did not, and his passenger was very unhappy. As to the date, he said he could have been told the police it was the end of November or the beginning of December. It was unusual to name names. In cross-examination by Mr. Monday, he said he did not know the defendants at all and had no contact with them before that day. Before the night drive, he had never been to that area at all. He could drive from A to B and not know the area. He was not lost, and he knew he was in the area of Rettendon on the way back. He said he was shown a map by the police to see if he could point the place out, but he could not remember it, and he could not remember if he did point it out. He could not remember pointing somewhere out at all. He had read in the papers of the killing of the 3 men in a car, and the papers had said Essex. How Green did not ring a bell, but it might be How Green was the place he pointed to. He remembered a garden nursery and a car sales place. Then again, as to the time, he was asked about the time again, and he said he arrived there around about 12ish, midnight, but he could not remember what day of the week it was, or whether it was the weekend or weekday. He probably knew that A127, but he was not good at reading maps. He looked at the Rettendon Turnpike on the map and said, "We went past at first because I couldn't get my bearings. We turned around and went back to the Rettendon Turnpike." He was looking for certain objects to get his bearings. He did not say, "That farm must be round here." It was the policeman who said that. He had other problems in his head, and he was thinking about other things, not just this. That time, he told the policeman to turn left. The nursery rang a bell, but names did not ring a bell. I don't know if Rectory Lane was the lane. There were gates on both sides opposite each other. As to the gate on the left, you had to leave the road to get to the lane, and the man climbed over the left gate. I turned around and waited half an hour or 3/4 of an hour. The time was getting on for 1 o'clock. As to whether there were houses at the bottom, he thought there were, but he did not drive that far. It was a few feet to the gate, and there was a field the other side of the gate. He could not see what was on the other side of the field. He had taken drugs himself, but he did not see what that had to do with it. He was talking of taking drugs that night. He said he admitted he had had a snort of coke before he arrived at the gate. He said maybe the passenger had a snort of coke. He at first said he was not prepared to say if the man snorted the coke, but then he was told that's what he told the police, that the man did snort coke that night. The man did it more than once before he got out the car. The man was wearing tracksuit tops and bottoms and gloves. Mr. Jasper said he was arrested for something else entirely different than this. He was now in prison. He was prosecuted for offences for which he was arrested, and he was not really worried about these offences. As far as he knew, the man was not arrested for anything and was not in trouble. He had not told anyone else what had happened that night. He had first mentioned what happened that night to get an easier time from the law, and he was hoping to get something out of it, to get an easier time. After he was interviewed, he was kept in a police station a couple of days. After that, he was not arrested or prosecuted for anything else that happened that night. He agreed he knew what a gun sounds like. He said he was awake in the car while waiting, but he did not hear any gunshots. He said he was possibly aware that a record was made of what he'd said at the police station, and someone told him that the documents were going to be disclosed to the defence lawyers. He was told what was going to happen a few months back, possibly earlier in 1997. He said he was not frightened of most things, but to a certain degree he would describe himself as a frightened man. He had not been threatened. In re-examination, Mr. Parkin said the passenger was wearing hospital gloves and trainers. The visit to Rettendon was his only visit, and it was done in darkness. The directions came from the passenger. He was finding his way by way of lights at night. It was daylight on the 15th of January, and it was easier with daylight than dark. When Jasper originally spoke to the police in January, he did name some names because his account was not made up. Members of the jury, that was his evidence in relation to what he said he did at that date that he did not identify, and at a time which he could give us at about midnight. But you remember, first of all, he said an hour plus or an hour minus. It is a matter for you what you conclude in relation to that witness. You are aware, of course, that there is no evidence from a pathologist or from a doctor who attended at the time of death and their evidence may be partly directed to suggest a time of death as around midnight. You will remember the other evidence as to the occupants of the Range Rover to the effect that they were going out that night to dinner in Romford, and you remember the note which Tate had left, as to which there is an admission. The evidence of Donna Jaggers being taken out to buy a new dress for the night out. You will also remember the evidence in relation to the two passengers who were not driving in that Range Rover of their contact with their mobile phones, one with it between his legs, the other having his middle finger through the lead to it. Equally, you remember the evidence of the scientist of the mobile phones throughout the evening up till midnight and thereafter. It is entirely for you to judge the evidence of Mr. Jasper to see where it takes you. But you want to take all the evidence into account in that case, just as you want to take all the evidence into account into relation to the conclusions you will come to of any of that evidence. Again, you do not take against Mr. Jasper just because he is at present in prison and deals with his evidence of his character in relation to his association with other criminals. You look at his evidence when he starts giving it entirely objectively, and when it comes before you just the same as any other witnesses. Later in the summing up, Michael Steele's receipt for his Hilux was discussed. Mr. Parkin said, "My lord, Mr. Steele has also invited your lordship through me to consider this, whether the jury ought to be reminded that is insofar as vehicles said to have been used by him on the evening on the 6th of December, that is, the Toyota is a diesel truck, and yet the receipt of petrol at Tesco's at 17:01 hours that day was for 4-star petrol. It is a point he invites you to consider referring to the jury. The Hilux, of course, is diesel. My lord, the RAV4 takes either." Yes, the RAV4 takes either. His point, of course, is the obvious one. Nichols says they were in the Hilux, which is diesel. The receipt the jury have clearly indicates is for 4-star petrol. My lord, he is also through me invites your lordship to remind the jury of the overall effect of 3 pieces of evidence taken together as presenting a picture, namely this: that when Rebecca Carr saw the Range Rover at about 5:30 on the 6th of December, Mr. Steele invites your lordship to, as it were, ask the jury also to focus on the fact that at this time, if Nichols is right, Mr. Steele was either on his way to Marks Tay from having got petrol, or at Marks Tay, or at the beginnings of his journey, certainly nowhere near the place where this witness claims there was a Range Rover with 3 men in it, plus a Sierra. In other words, he, Steele, on that evidence could have not possibly been in that Range Rover at the time, at that place, or having come, as our evidence indicates, from that general direction. And I must emphasise that word, general direction, of Basildon. You will remember Jack Wilms' evidence about the letterbox at Dennis's Wilms, which he knocked on, went round the back and thought he shouted through. He was shown Exhibit 301 and he agreed in Exhibit 301 the photograph the letterbox was not on the door but on the wall. I reminded you also of his answer that Dennis could have changed the door. I think I also want to remind you that the photograph was produced by the prosecution very late in the case, and in particular it was produced after Dennis Wilms had completed his evidence. So there is actually no evidence before you of what was the state of Dennis Wilms' door on the 6th of December 1995. In the absence of such evidence, you may think that bearing in mind the burden of proof is on the prosecution, the fair way to deal with that evidence is not to assume that the door was in 1995 as it is now, and so not to use that as a point against Mr. Wilms. Another matter in relation to Mr. Wilms concerns the 1859 call when he was using his telephone on the 6th of December. His evidence was as to 2 things. 1, why he was ringing. I remind you of what he said to the purpose of the call. The other is to how long the phone was used and what happened, what he heard. His evidence to you was that he did not get through that call at 1859. All he got was static and therefore he discontinued the call. There is no question in his evidence of him saying anything. He did not actually get to talk to Darren Nichols and how long it would have taken him to explain the things he was phoning for is not material to his evidence. Another thing to remind you is of the fact that the fuel from the Texaco filling garage at 5:01 that night was, according to Exhibit 270 and 271, 4-star. And you remember Mr. Steele's evidence that it was put into a Renault 21. And you remember that the Hilux took diesel, not 4-star, and it was the Hilux which, on the prosecution case, was being used that night. Also, the evidence of Billy Jasper as to what he saw looking into the holdalls. He referred to the weapons as a pump-action shotgun. That was his evidence. But that it was a sawn-off pump-action shotgun. As to count 2, 3 and 4, the prosecution case is that there was a falling out between Steele and Tate and a threat by Tate on the life of Steele. They say that Tate, Tucker and Rolfe were lured by Wilms and Steele to that lane on the 6th of December and were killed by shotgun cartridges fired into the back of their heads. As to count 5, they said that after the killings, Nichols at Steele's request got him a fresh shotgun. Fresh because the one that had been used was said to have been ground up and took to him at Meadow Cottage. They say it was December or January that Nichols last touched the gun, and it was in the roof of Meadow Cottage. Thereafter, Nichols did not do anything about the gun, and in particular did not tell the police about it. He said it was no plant. In relation to all the counts in the indictment of the prosecution case is that despite all the legitimate criticism that can be made of Darren Nichols, that criticism is valid, but his evidence, they say, from the witness box was reliable and can be believed. The defence of Wilms and Steele, in a nutshell, to the allegation of agreement to smuggle cannabis, is that there was no such agreement. Steele never took the rib across the North Sea on any smuggling trips. The rib was bought as a diving vessel and was used as such when it had been on sea trials. The trip, which ended on the 8th of November, was a trip for sea trials, which was dabbed by a mechanical failure. It was not a smuggling trip. Their case is that the account given by Nichols is a lying one. They point that all there is to be said against Nichols is a matter you should consider. Everything including his previous criminal activities, both those for which he has convictions and more particularly for those he has not. His later and more recent criminal activities, including the criminality with Detective Constable A. They point to the taped conversations with Detective Constable A between him and Nichols. They point to what Nichols said in the third interview, having been told he had told the truth, but nonetheless minimalising his involvement by not telling it. They sum up in their arguments what you heard for days quite rightably, because it is necessarily to test matters in the evidence that Nichols gave in this court. They urge you to say that you cannot believe Nichols in the light of these facts. They refer to the great caution that advised you to use in looking at Nichols' evidence at the beginning of this summing up. They say that Nichols has blended fact and fiction and has been prompted or guided by dishonest police officers, Mr. Winston and Mr. Brown, in the interviews and the takings of his statements. They suggest that the telephone schedules are deliberately dishonest. They say they are not innocent errors. The errors are made deliberately to be misleading. As examples of that, they point to telephone calls that are not there. Admissions on the telephone schedule earlier at tab 4, pages 7 and 9, in relation to calls on the 5th and 6th of November, one at 8:46 and one at 16:36. These are examples that they put to you of the omissions. When they say about the omissions, they are deliberate and meant to be misled. They say the evidence of Rebecca Carr as to the time she saw the Range Rover, the evidence of Kevin Tarbuck as to what he saw mean the prosecution cannot disprove their alibi. They point to the evidence of William Jasper and Stephen Rodgers of raising the possibility that someone else killed these men at about midnight. As to count 5 against Steele, the shotgun exhibit 103, he says that Nichols could have not put the shotgun into his roof, which he claims to have done. Had been done so, it would have fallen straight through, because there was no ceilings there then. Steele says the progress of his work was that it was not possible to hide the gun where he had said. The defence said there was no ceiling up there, the trellises had been taken down, part of it jetted up into the roof space. so there could have been no roof there to hide the gun. Those are all arguments put into a nutshell, members of the jury. You will have in mind, having listened very carefully to the way those and other arguments were deployed for the prosecution and the defence, you really now are coming to the last words of the summing up. You must reach, if you can, a unanimous verdict. As you know, the law allows me, in certain circumstances, to accept a verdict which is not the verdict of you all. Those circumstances have not arisen. It may be that they do not arise, but they have not arisen yet. So when you must retire, I ask you to reach a verdict on which each one of you is agreed, all 12. Should, however, the time come when I accept a majority verdict, then I will call you back into the court and give you further direction. Lastly, the question of your retirement. You know you are going to a hotel at the end of the evening on the assumption that you'll still be considering your verdict at that stage. What happens about the hotel? Can you continue with any discussion once you leave here about the case? The answer is a flat no, I am afraid. I'm afraid I'll have to tell you that it is the essence of the jury system that you should reach your verdicts when you're together in the jury room with the jury bailiff outside to ensure your complete privacy. You must decide this case on the evidence and arguments that you have heard in the court. You must not seek any further evidence or information about the case. Not merely should you not discuss the case with anyone outside your number, but you should not discuss this case at all, even amongst yourselves, once you have left the court today until you return to your room tomorrow. That was on the 15th of January 1998, when the jury of 8 women and 4 men had listened intently since September the 1st to a wealth of evidence from dozens of witnesses. And on the 20th of January 1998, the jury returned with their verdict. The following article was released on the same week with the headline Gangland Killers Jailed for Life by Kim White. The gangland slaying of 3 drug dealers in Rettendon was always going to be a tremendous task for Essex detectives, but with 2 men starting life sentences for the murders, it was clearly not impossible. The execution-style killing of Pat Tate, 37, Tony Tucker, 38, and Craig Rolfe, just 26, by Michael Steele and Jack Wilms, revolved around an international drugs deal which turned sour. It plunged former Superintendent Ivan Dibley into the biggest investigation of his career, just 4 months before he was due to retire. And the detective who took over the inquiry, Detective Superintendent Brian Story, said this week he was both satisfied and delighted by the verdict. More importantly, he had to send a message to all criminals that even these seen as big league are not immune from justice. The verdict comes after an investigation and trial revealing some breathtaking statistics. During the 2-year investigation, a team of about 25 detectives took over 1,000 statements and completed 5,000 actions. During the 21-week Old Bailey trial, the Metropolitan Police supplied daily 72 officers to provide round-the-clock personal protection for each and every jury member. The main prosecution witness was in the box almost continuously for an amazing 25 days. The judge took 7.5 days to sum up, and the jury took less than 5 to convict, delivering an unanimous verdict. It was certainly worth the wait, and waiting was something the inquiry team was used to, Superintendent Story explained. We had an idea very early on who was responsible for the murders, and an early arrest may have provided additional forensic evidence. But there were other risks to consider. The nature of the people involved meant an early arrest could frighten off vital witnesses and also meant the murderers might restrict their criminal activities. Essex police chose to sit tight and it paid off. We took a calculated risk, but we wanted to ensure that we were in the best possible position, evidently, before we made a move, said Mr. Story. The villains were active and dangerous criminals who were aware of how to cover their tracks and conceal forensic evidence, even down to knowing what clothes to wear. Steele also admitted in court that he believed he was under constant surveillance by both police and customs. Ironically, it was the use of their mobile phones and careful analysis which helped secure their convictions. Mr. Story said Steele's downfall was partly due to the fact he thought he was untouchable and thought he would never get caught. By biding our time, we proved him wrong. How long the message will last, I don't know, but the message is that no matter how professional you are or think you are, and no matter how much you have planned your crime or think you have, you are not immune. A miraculous investigation and of course a few lucky breaks can make even these crimes solvable. Labelled a one-witness trial, Mr. Story admits that the key prosecution was of vital importance to the investigation. He said, "I've always thought we would have enough to make an arrest, but not necessarily enough to convict. We had a lot of information from the public, but very little cooperation from those close to the victims because of the nature of the crime. The key was getting someone who knew what went on that night to talk. An investigation relied heavily on us using a full range of policing skills. The only way to combat those professional criminals was to use every aspect of policing available, and the outcome is a tribute to all those involved, not only within Essex Police, but within other agencies who assisted with us, such as HM Customs and Circus, and we thank everyone involved, no matter how small their role." It's not the first time Essex Police earned such a result. Another lengthy inquiry known as Operation Max led to the conviction of Jason Veller and his gang, who headed a drugs and torture regime in Essex. The trial of Michael Steele and Jack Wilms did really rely heavily on one man, the supergrass Darren Nichols, who, since the trial, has been in witness protection living under a different name. But when the CCRC finally do finish their review of the convictions of Michael Steele and Jack Wilms, maybe Darren Nichols' happily ever after story may come crashing to an end.